While the university is commonly understood to be a place where different knowledge systems enter into dialogue and debate, the institutional structures of the university tend to acculturate and conscript different kinds of knowledge into their own existing categories for what can be known, how knowledge can be organized, and what forms of knowledge are legitimate and credible. The Different Knowing Speaker series and interviews address the question of if and how the university can be a place of different knowings, different epistemologies, different knowledges.
I think I've always looked specifically at authenticity as almost something that we use as a term, but a fickle term that, is something that, when you think, well, what is authentic is the question, and I always get asked the question, like, are you Kenyan, are you Canadian, are you Indian, like, what are you? And for me, I am all of these things. I embody all of the places that I am through, lived experience or a told experience. But for me, it's something that, to be an authentic self is something that is constantly changing, something that's not in flux. That's something that is in flux, not stable. And so I think that with the new work, it's being influenced by the places that I've traveled to, the experiences, and so that in itself is partially the same kind of way that I kind of see my cultural identity kind of growing and changing. In the past, like, a lot of my work has dealt with like the idea of like the object, the cultural object, the souvenir versus the artifact, and looking at notions of provenance and loss of ownership. And so with the work, the neons that you had mentioned, I was actually looking at masks from the Met collection, and specific masks that have almost like a made-up provenance, where artisan has been named to this object because of specificity of the way the object is being carved, let's say, or if it comes from a specific region. So Western historians have then named an artist, and so almost like a reversal of, going back to colonialism, have said that this object or these objects will be named, for example, made by the master of Buli. And so the work in those neons are actually 3 objects made by the quote-unquote the master of Buli that I've then reproduced in neon, and they sort of like stand outside of a gallery window, and they sort of almost play on this sort of commercial, in New York, they're in Canal Street, there's so much neon, and they're advertising devices, but they're not saying anything, but they're actually at the same time pulsing Morse code signals asking where the master of Buli is. So it's sort of like acting as a non-textual way of prescribing language, but it's not necessarily articulated or comprehended. But at the same time, light acts as a beacon and then calls people forward. So I'm kind of playing on those sort of liminal ways to sort of like call, to prescribe language, but then almost then saying like, well, what is this? People have actually written me from seeing that show and saying things like, well, are these Mexican wrestling masks? And I don't mind that, 'cause I like that the object then becomes hybrid. It becomes many different things, and it can act as a placeholder for the object in the Met collection, but it can also become something else. And for me, that's an interesting place to play with the works with regards to authenticity, because I think it's allowed to be more fluid. What's interesting for me is like the whole show is based on Canal Street. And Canal Street, and specifically because on Canal Street, many African immigrants sell masks as New York souvenirs. So for me, when I first moved to New York, this was like a real interesting place. I was trying to find my place of belonging. How do I function here? But then I'm also like, well, now these immigrants are selling masks, but they've transformed. They still signify Africanism, but now they also function as a New York souvenir. And for me, around Canal Street, there's all these Chinese restaurants that are always, stating authentic Chinese food, and so it's sort of like everywhere in this, the semiotics in the space, or it's just saying like this is authentic, and people come and they're like, we're getting real Chinese food, but for me it's always like, well, what's authentic Chinese food in New York? Like, like it's this again place in that word to sort of give authority to say that it's more real, perhaps.